any solution to the issue of illegal migration and human trafficking, either across the Mediterranean or across the English Channel or elsewhere, it's got to have a basis in law and diplomacy. And there may well be a military contribution to that, but it can't be a military-only solution. So I think and we've got experience of this both in the UK and wider through partners and allies. I think a more likely role for the military, for the Royal Navy or for any navy, is to help with picture building, with intelligence gathering, perhaps with some command and control.
We are very confident that our policy of securely picking people up and safely taking them back to France, we are entirely confident that that falls within other conventions of international law.
Well, let's get into the details of this with Kevin Rowlands, who's journal editor at the RUSI think tank and former head of the Royal Navy Strategic Studies Centre. Hello, Kevin. Welcome to Times Radio.
Hello, good to be here.
So, just give me your overall thoughts on Nigel Farage's proposals. You know, are they practical, militarily, diplomatically, legally?
Well, Seb, I listened to your introduction, and I think we should probably say from the outset that I think Nigel Farage's policies and this announcement is partly achieving his aim. It's getting us talking about, however impractical, getting us to talk about an issue as though it was a really simple thing to deal with and not taking into consideration everything else. And we're now on the defensive and trying to explain why it wouldn't work rather than go out there and look for real solutions to the issues.
Well, I think that's certainly the case, that Nigel Farage is most comfortable talking about this. But it's easy in a press conference stand up and saying it's really simple, we're going to deploy the Navy and that's it. But at some point, some government, maybe, Nigel Farage would like a reform-led government, would have to do this. Do you think it could work? Let's be a bit less sceptical for a moment.
So I would say there is any solution to the issue of illegal migration and human trafficking, either across the Mediterranean or across the English Channel or elsewhere, it's got to have a basis in law and diplomacy. And there may well be a military contribution to that, but it can't be a military-only solution. So I think and we've got experience of this both in the UK and wider through partners and allies. I think a more likely role for the military, for the Royal Navy or for any navy, is to help with picture building, with intelligence gathering, perhaps with some command and control. But all that will be in support of the specialist civilian agencies, Border Force, HM Coast Guard and so on, that can do this properly. And it's got to be done in cooperation with our partners, not against them. So France has got to play a part in this, Belgium's got to play a part, and any other country as well. So there could be a military role, but it's not building a fortress around the UK.
Well, if Mr. Farage was here, what he would say, Kevin, is that we've had a lot of diplomatic work. An awful lot of money has gone from the UK to France over many years to try and stop the small boats. And the numbers are down pretty significantly year on year, but they're still crossing in quite big numbers. So what Reform are proposing is essentially Britain alone, is to say that we've got our Navy, we're going to deploy it, and we think it's all going to be fine. Mr. Farage did say he thought what they are proposing is kind of acceptable under international law. How do you read that?
I think that in that statement that you played, he talked about some things would be acceptable in other parts of international law. I think he needs to name what those parts would be. But I think my response to him would be, and to the British public, is we've got to remember what the Navy and what the armed forces are there for. We've got the debate ongoing at the moment that there is inadequate funding for defence, that we don't spend enough, that we haven't got the capabilities, that our armed forces are stretched, and that we've got rising threats from Russia in the high north and the North Atlantic and a war on the European continent. To divert attention and divert resources away from already stretched armed forces into something that shouldn't really be their role that's not going to make us safer. I think we need to remember, what are nuclear submarines for? What are aircraft carriers for? What are anti-air defence destroyers and anti-submarine frigates for. They're not for picking up migrants in small boats. We've got better ways of doing that. So, as I say, I think maybe a military contribution to the overall picture, but it's not putting an aircraft carrier in the channel and trying to turn a boat round. That's rather ludicrous.
Well, Kevin, there has been a lot of criticism about the state of the Royal Navy fleet at the moment, particularly when we saw the Iranian war kick off and the UK was left somewhat lacking in trying to defend some of its assets in the region. Even if there was a reform-led government and they were able to do this, does the Navy have the capacity to be patrolling the channel when there's so much demand on its limited capacity elsewhere?
I think, like everything else, it's a question of prioritisation. So the Royal Navy, as any other organisation, could probably do a role in the Channel. It could do a role in the North Sea. It could do a role in the Middle East. The challenge comes when all of these things happen at once and you become stretched and then overstretched. And so if there is the armed forces of this country, thank goodness, still work in a military-civil relationship where the civil power gives the orders and the military obliges. So if there is a legitimate government in place giving legitimate direction, then of course our armed forces, our police forces, everything would do what they had to do to carry out the orders. But we need to balance that with what is a real threat? What are we facing in the world today? And what is the best use for those scarce resources? And my argument would be it's probably not doing this.
And finally, Kevin, let's just say there was a government that had this policy and it went to the First Sea Lord and said, right, you are now doing this. This is what the Prime Minister of the day wants. Is there a world where the Royal Navy could say, well, hang on a minute, I'm not sure this is legal. We are bound by international law. We are bound by conventions that would stop us doing this. Or would they just say, well, sorry, Mr. Farage, you're the Prime Minister, so he's got to do what you have to say. How do you think the Navy would view this internally?
I think the Navy, the First Sea Lord, everyone involved would take legal advice. They would, we call them doing estimates. So you would look at the situation, you would look at the options that you have, the potential to carry out activities and what the constraints may be, whether they are resource constraints or legal constraints or even ethical constraints. And you would operate within the boundaries that are legal and ethical at the time. So, what could the Navy do in this situation? It certainly couldn't go out and sink small boats and kill illegal migrants crossing the Channel. That is a non-starter. Could it stop them in UK waters? Well, potentially it could. But then what do you do with them? Can you imagine a situation where a British warship with a lot of migrants on board sails into French or Belgian waters and tries to disembark them? That's just not it's not a feasible approach. If we flip it around the other way, would we accept a French warship sailing to Dover and trying to land a bunch of people who we don't want there and claim that it's their domestic policy? So I think we need to think about this in the round. The Navy would do its best. It would fulfill its role. But I do think that role is more likely to be, as I say, and we've had this experience in other operations, it would be in command and control and picture building and supporting the legitimate civilian agencies that do this.
Well, thank you very much. That was Kevin Rowlands, journal editor at the RUSI think tank and former head of the Royal Navy Strategic Studies Centre. We've had plenty of listeners get in touch with this topic as well. We had people